The Gulf of Mexico is a very unique place geologically. It is home to the largest oil and gas producing region in the continental United States, and it is also one of the most complex continental shelves in the world. So in the Gulf of Mexico, the northern Gulf of Mexico, we have oil and gas bearing shales with a salt sheet underneath them and a layer of sediment on top. And as these different geological forces interact, we get cracks in the oil-bearing shale and we get natural seepage coming out of the seafloor. So at thousands of different places in the Gulf of Mexico, oil and gas is naturally seeping very slowly from the seafloor. And in those environments, we have some very special communities of animals that have evolved to live there. These environments are rich in energy. There's bacteria that can live off methane, there's bacteria that degrade the oil, and there's bacteria that live off other gases that are produced, like hydrogen sulfide. And this forms the basis of a food chain. So in these places where there's cold seeps, there's luxuriant communities of giant tube worms and mussels that can cover areas bigger than a football field. Now, the same bacteria that are eating the oil and eating the methane, as a byproduct of that, they're creating the chemical environment where rocks form. And at places where you have oil seeps, you have carbonates form. So areas where there's rocks are areas where special communities can move in. And corals love rocks. So we've found that, in fact, most of the deep corals in the Gulf of Mexico are associated with oil seeps. Either areas that are still seeping or areas that were oil seeps over the last 10,000, 100,000 years.
The primary goals of the Lophelia II study that was really initiated by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, our BOEM, were focused on understanding all of the variables that lead to the distribution of these deep sea coral habitats throughout the deep Gulf of Mexico. This is critical for information needs that's required by management to help protect these environments and avoid the impacts from oil and gas exploration and production.
We named the study Lophelia II mostly because it was focused around probably the poster child for deep water corals, Lophelia pertusa. This is a species that has a worldwide distribution. It's the one that we really know the most about going into the study. We're trying to learn a lot more about its biology and its distribution in the Gulf of Mexico, but we're really starting to tease apart what makes it tick, why it shows up in the places where it's found, how it can form these large reef structures, and what kind of other organisms are attracted to the habitat that it makes in the deep sea.
We'll be going out on a large oceanographic vessel, the Ron Brown, NOAA's flagship for research. It holds 34 scientists. We'll be using the Jason II ROV to do work on the seafloor. It will dive to the seafloor every day. We'll be spending most of the time with it on the seafloor. It can stay down for days, where we can see exactly what it's doing. And through its 4 or 5 camera systems, we'll have pilots and engineers and navigators that are running the ROV in the van with us. We will collect animals, collect mud samples, we'll collect water samples. We'll be shooting video, photo mosaics, and close-ups of the animals.
The American part of the Gulf of Mexico is many thousands of square miles of deep ocean dark and without landmarks, without street signs, without GPS. And in that many thousands of square miles, we have to find the few sites where there's a rocky bottom, where there's promontories, hillsides, mounds that corals can attach to. And it's probably more difficult than finding a needle in a haystack, because at least a haystack you can see. In the case of finding the seeps, we had to do a very different process. We started with maps of the geology and geophysics of the Gulf, which were compiled by the oil industry in their quest for places where there would be economic oil reserves. And our team of geologists and geophysicists went through this data, and they picked out areas where the signal of the bottom in the mapping that had been done indicated that there were hard substrates, rocks. And they also looked for places where there were steep slopes. So the combination of a hard substrate and a steep slope is the kinds of conditions that support the formation of these deep water coral reefs.
Lophelia is really well adapted to the deep water environment. It doesn't contain the photosynthetic algae as symbionts that a lot of the shallow water corals do. It tends to grow very slowly because it's entirely reliant on feeding from particles that rain down from the surface. And Lophelia is well adapted to these deep water conditions where there's no light, very low temperatures, and a lot of other oceanographic variables that we're really just beginning to understand.
This project was designed to explore and discover new deepwater coral sites in the Gulf of Mexico, characterize those sites, but also conduct experiments that'll let us understand how the corals work and why they are where they are.
Like many marine invertebrates, Lophelia are broadcast spawners, and so they release gametes into the water column, and the gametes will come together and fertilize and become larvae, and larvae travel through the water column for probably somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks, and then they find an adequate settlement area, which is usually a hard substrate, where they settle down and start maturing into adult corals. I've been studying connectivity between reefs in the Gulf, but previously, coming into this project, we really only knew about one area basically in the Gulf that had a lot of Lophelia. So now we have really nice coverage throughout the Gulf, and we've been able to adequately sample to do population genetics, which is kind of like a genetic fingerprinting, and then we've been looking at whether the genetic signatures are homogenized among the Gulf reefs or whether they're distinct, meaning that there's not a lot of connectivity. And so now we have a really nice data set where we can say that it looks like all of the reefs that we've surveyed are very genetically connected, or the connectivity is high. And we now have a data set where we can say that fairly robustly.
In my opinion, one of the biggest discoveries that we've made in the Lophelia II expeditions was the discovery of Roberts Reef. This is a site that's really spectacular. It's got a full, complete coverage of live Lophelia corals, this extensive reef structure, lots of other coral species living there as well, black corals and sea fans. It's got a really high diversity of associated fauna along with the corals. And it's a site that we almost overlooked. We went to see it, but we weren't really expecting a coral reef, and it was really astounding to see this well-developed reef structure in an area that we might not have predicted would have a reef on it. And it's because we think the coral structure is so extensive, and that mound is just entirely composed of coral framework, the skeleton, that it's scattering the sound waves. And so we don't get a hard return on the sound like we would from a carbonate, which is where the corals generally start to form. But in this case, we had this coral structure that may have been building up over thousands of years that formed this huge mound and this live, thriving reef gave us this signature that we wouldn't have predicted would have a reef on it.
The Gulf of Mexico has over 300 years of maritime history that has resulted in quite a few shipwrecks. Several hundred wrecks, or even several thousand wrecks, are thought to be lost in the Gulf of Mexico. And with this project, we've had the opportunity to study 8 of these wrecks from a variety of time periods. And the study of these wrecks tells us not only about the maritime history of each of those periods, but also gives us an understanding of how these wrecks are functioning as artificial reefs in the deep water reaches of the Gulf, something that's really never been looked at in depth before. The Gulf Pen was a tanker during World War II that was sunk by a German U-boat here in the Gulf. Archaeologically, it represents a wreck from a period of great conflict worldwide. For this project in particular, it also represents one of the largest growths of Lophelia ever discovered in the Gulf of Mexico.
The shipwrecks have been just amazing to actually see with the ROV. The Lophelia growth on the wrecks is just absolutely astounding. They are healthy and huge. They're also interesting because we know when they sank. So when you look at a natural reef, it's impossible to know how long those individual corals have been alive. But we know with the shipwrecks that we have a time constraint. So this is something that's very unique compared to the natural reefs. But we can also use our genetic markers to see what natural populations likely populated the shipwrecks. And it looks like the shipwrecks are getting populated from all sorts of reefs. So the larvae are coming from far away and close by, and the Lophelia are very healthy and thriving. Our findings that there's a lot of connectivity among the Lophelia reefs in the Gulf is really good news. It's the best case scenario for long-term conservation of the reefs, because basically what that means is that we haven't found any reefs that are isolated. Isolated reefs are very unlikely to be repopulated by other Lophelia larvae if they're destroyed. And instead what we see is that there's a lot of connectivity. And so if a reef area is destroyed, it's likely to be repopulated. And it's also likely to be repopulated with a fair amount of genetic diversity.
Over the course of the project, based on the information we have from the 8 shipwrecks that we studied, our understanding of what's going on with these shipwrecks has changed. Initially, we have seen these shipwrecks as static, not really changing, but we now see that the changes are much more dynamic than we originally thought. And it comes from a variety of sources, not only environmental with the currents and the bottom changing, but also with some of the animal life and the sea life that we find that they're actually impacting the wrecks in a more substantial way than we ever thought they could. And that's something that we're definitely going to be exploring in the future as we continue to look at these wrecks in the Gulf of Mexico as well as wrecks around the world.
You know, one of the things that limits the ability of Lophelia reefs to form in the Gulf of Mexico is the shortage of hard surfaces for the larvae to land on, the adults to grow up on, and the associated fauna to orient to. The exceptions to that are the hard bottom generated by seepage that we've already talked about, shipwrecks, and increasingly in deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, oil platforms and the engineering structures created by oil and energy production. And these are places where artificial reefs, in a way, are installed, by the industry, and these can provide a stepping stone or an expansion of the habitat and create more living coral colonies than would otherwise be possible.
The Lophelia coral was discovered at record depths, both shallow and deep. The shallowest depth was about 200 meters, which was significantly shallower than other corals that have been seen on natural habitats. But the deep record is probably more spectacular because it's significantly deeper, 400 feet deeper than any previous record at about 800 meters. And also the growth rates of these colonies was determined to be much greater than anything that has been seen on a natural reef, with growth rates of 1 inch or about 25 millimeters, over 5 times faster than has been published for Lophelia growth on natural habitats.
So this will be our main goal, will in fact be to study the deep water coral communities of the Gulf of Mexico. But in light of the recent Deepwater Horizon disaster, we'll be supplementing that work with some additional explorations for sites in closer to the spill, and we'll be revisiting some of the sites we know very well to see if we can detect any changes over the last year since we were there last.
In fact, some of our biggest sites in the Viosca Knoll region, including Roberts Reef, are within 40 kilometers or so of the Deepwater Horizon, the former site of the Deepwater Horizon. We obviously didn't pick these sites because of their proximity to that location. We had visited them a number of times in the past, and we were there in 2009 at a lot of these sites, setting up long-term experiments, areas that we photographed very carefully that we could return to. We had instruments on the sea floor that were measuring the oceanography, the particles naturally coming down from the surface. So after the Deepwater Horizon incident in April of 2010, we got to go back in 2010, and we already had an established presence on the sea floor. We already had a number of these sites that we had been working on, in some cases, for years. And so we could very quickly go in and reassess the site and see what sort of condition they were in. For many of the Lophelia sites, we were pleasantly surprised that we didn't actually see any drastic visual evidence of impact from the oil spill. We're continuing to monitor these sites, and we don't have a 100% answer, a very clear answer that they're totally out of the woods. We don't know. There could be long-term effects on the health of the coral and their ability to reproduce that we don't understand yet, and we need to continue to monitor, and we will do that. But we were happy that our initial visit as part of this Lophelia II expedition in 2010, that the corals looked like they were in pretty good health.
So we've been studying the communities in the Gulf of Mexico for decades. The communities we study start at about 300 meters and go down to 3,000 meters. And with the Deepwater Horizon disaster at 1,400 meters in the Gulf of Mexico, we had an oil spill where the oil was being released at the same depth as many of the communities that we study. And in fact, they were using dispersant at depth, which would have the effect of keeping the oil in that horizon. So as we've all heard, a lot of the oil has disappeared. It was contained, collected, some evaporated, some was burnt off. Some is formed into globules and washed up on shore. And people are wondering where the rest went. Well, there's growing evidence that a lot of that oil has ended up in the deep sea, on the sea floor. And our work on the communities of megafauna that live in these environments sets the stage to see if, in fact, this oil has impacted any of those communities.
Yeah, this project has really been exceptional in that it has resulted in tangible impacts on management policy that protect these kinds of sensitive deepwater habitats. Two examples that are directly related to the Lophelia II study were the increase of buffer distances for discharges from the surface that has been extended, essentially doubled to 2,000 feet, as well as the impacts of anchors on the bottom, physical impacts. And we also increased the depth range, or made it shallower, from 400 to 300 meters for the requirement of a review of every plan that comes in for both exploration and production activities, as well as pipeline installations, to ensure that we're covering all of the habitat where deep sea corals may occur in the Gulf.